man you just watched wasn't an exception. Over the last 2 years, videos of gray-haired Russian soldiers have appeared across the battlefield again and again. Men who look old enough to be grandfathers are now fighting in one of the most technologically advanced wars in history. But why would a modern military send aging men into a battlefield dominated by FPV drones, thermal cameras, satellite surveillance, and precision-guided artillery? At first glance, it may look like Russia is simply running out of young soldiers. But the reality is far more complicated. The answer lies deep inside Russia's military doctrine, its history, and the brutal reality of a war that has become less about advanced technology and more about who can replace their losses the fastest. To understand why older soldiers are now appearing on the front lines, we first need to understand what kind of war Russia expected to fight. When Russian forces crossed into Ukraine in February 2022, the Kremlin wasn't preparing for a long war of attrition. The military had been restructured over the previous decade for fast, decisive campaigns. Following the reforms introduced after the 2008 war with Georgia, Russia transformed much of its Soviet-era military. Instead of maintaining millions of reservists waiting for mobilization, it built a smaller, more professional force made up of permanently ready units that could deploy within hours. Those reforms appeared successful. Russian troops seized Crimea in 2014 with remarkable speed, and the military demonstrated an ability to rapidly concentrate forces for regional operations. The belief inside Moscow was that future wars would also be short, fast, and won through mobility rather than sheer numbers. But Ukraine shattered that assumption. Instead of collapsing within days, Ukrainian resistance forced Russia into a prolonged conflict unlike anything it had planned for. This wasn't Iraq in 2003, where overwhelming technological superiority allowed one side to dominate from the opening hours. In Ukraine, both armies possessed drones, electronic warfare systems, precision weapons, and modern reconnaissance capabilities. Every major troop movement could be detected from the air. Large armored assaults were often spotted long before reaching the battlefield, allowing artillery and FPV drones to strike them before they even reached their objectives. As the front stabilized into hundreds of kilometers of trenches, minefields, and constant drone surveillance, the nature of the war fundamentally changed. Suddenly, the most important factor was no longer who had the most advanced equipment. It became who could continue replacing soldiers, vehicles, and ammunition faster than the enemy. For Russia, this meant abandoning many of the principles behind its post-2008 military reforms and gradually returning to something much older, the Soviet model of warfare. For centuries, Russian military strategy relied on one decisive advantage: numbers. From the Russian Empire to the Soviet Union during the Second World War, the country's military doctrine was built around the ability to mobilize enormous numbers of soldiers, absorb heavy casualties, and continue attacking until the enemy's resources were exhausted. The military reforms of the late 2000s tried to move away from that philosophy, but after the setbacks of 2022, Russia faced a difficult reality. Its professional army simply wasn't large enough to sustain continuous offensive operations across a front stretching more than 1,000 kilometers. The solution wasn't to completely modernize, it was to expand. And that's when Russia began returning to mass recruitment, large contract bonuses, shortened training programs, and a constant flow of replacement troops. That decision would eventually reshape not only the Russian army, but also the kind of soldiers now appearing on the battlefield. So, if Russia has over 1 million active military personnel, why are so many videos from the front showing soldiers in their late 40s, 50s, or even older? The answer isn't simply that Russia has run out of young men. Instead, it's the result of how Moscow chose to sustain a long war without triggering another politically unpopular nationwide mobilization. When Russia announced its partial mobilization in September 2022, hundreds of thousands of reservists were called up. While it helped stabilize the front, it also sparked public backlash. Large numbers of military-aged men left the country to avoid being drafted, and the Kremlin quickly realized that another mass mobilization could carry significant political costs. So rather than forcing millions into military service, Russia shifted toward a different strategy. It started paying. Across many Russian regions, signing bonuses and military salaries rose dramatically. For people living in wealthier cities like Moscow or St. Petersburg, the money was attractive. But for men living in poorer regions, where wages were often only a fraction of what the military offered, those contracts became life-changing. For many, joining the army wasn't driven by ideology. It was driven by economics. A single military contract could provide more money than several years of civilian work. That changed who volunteered. Instead of recruiting primarily young men beginning their careers, recruiters increasingly attracted older workers, factory employees, miners, truck drivers, security guards, and unemployed men looking for financial stability. Many had families to support. Many had few economic opportunities left. And many believed they still had something valuable to offer through their experience. As a result, videos from the battlefield began showing men whose gray hair and weathered faces stood in stark contrast to the image of a modern professional army. But recruiting older volunteers solved only one problem. The bigger challenge was preparing them for one of the deadliest battlefields in modern history. Unlike Cold War armies that trained for months before deployment, many new recruits received only a few weeks of basic instruction before being assigned to frontline units. Instead of practicing large-scale maneuvers, training increasingly focused on small assault teams, operating in pairs or groups of just a few soldiers. That wasn't necessarily because commanders preferred this method. It was because the battlefield itself had changed. Large formations had become easy targets. Small groups stood a better chance of avoiding detection. But better didn't mean safe. Far from it. Today, almost every movement near the front is watched. Reconnaissance drones patrol overhead day and night. Thermal cameras detect soldiers even in darkness. Electronic surveillance tracks radio transmissions. And once a target is located, FPV drones can be launched within minutes. Unlike traditional artillery, FPV drones don't need to bombard an entire area. They hunt individuals. Flying at speeds exceeding 100 kilometers per hour, these drones can weave through trees, buildings, and trenches before striking with remarkable precision. A soldier may survive artillery. He may survive machine gun fire. But escaping a drone that is actively chasing him is an entirely different challenge. Even elite troops struggle against them. For older soldiers, the challenge can become even greater. Military experts generally agree that modern infantry combat demands extraordinary physical endurance. Assault teams often carry more than 30 kilograms of equipment while running, crawling, climbing, and reacting instantly to threats from every direction. As people age, reaction times, stamina, and recovery speed naturally decline, even among healthy individuals. That doesn't mean older soldiers cannot fight. Many bring valuable experience, discipline, and emotional resilience. But against FPV drones, age and experience alone offer little protection. The drone doesn't care how many years someone has served. It only needs a direct hit. This helps explain why so many drone videos show exhausted soldiers walking alone across open ground, desperately searching for cover, while a camera silently follows them from above. In many cases, they aren't conducting massive offensives. They're part of small assault groups, tasked with probing enemy defenses, identifying firing positions, or attempting to gain only a few hundred meters of ground. Western analysts often describe these operations as part of a broader war of attrition. The objective isn't always an immediate breakthrough. Sometimes it's simply to maintain relentless pressure, forcing the enemy to expend ammunition, drones, and manpower while gradually wearing down defensive positions. That harsh reality has led many observers to describe these repeated assaults as a meat grinder. The term doesn't mean commanders intentionally send soldiers to die. Rather, it reflects the brutal mathematics of attritional warfare, where both sides continue suffering heavy losses while fighting over relatively small pieces of territory. And no technology symbolizes that reality better than the FPV drone. A machine costing only a few $100s can destroy a soldier whose training, equipment, transport, and years of experience represent an investment worth many thousands more. In modern warfare, the balance between cost and destruction has changed dramatically, and nowhere is that transformation more visible than on the battlefields of Ukraine. But it isn't only the soldiers revealing Russia's struggle to adapt. The vehicles arriving at the front tell an equally remarkable story. Because alongside aging soldiers, Russia has also begun deploying tanks that were designed more than 60 years ago, machines built for the Cold War, now facing one of the most technologically advanced battlefields in history. If aging soldiers are one side of Russia's manpower problem, its armored vehicles tell the other half of the story. Over the last 3 years, countless videos have shown Russian trains transporting tanks that many believed belonged in museums rather than on a modern battlefield. Among them is one vehicle that has become a symbol of Russia's equipment shortages, the T-62 tank. Introduced in 1961, the T-62 entered service during the height of the Cold War. To put that into perspective, when the T-62 first rolled off the production line, Yuri Gagarin had only recently become the first human in space. The M16 rifle had not yet entered widespread U.S. military service, and decades would pass before tanks like the American M1 Abrams or Germany's Leopard 2 were even designed. Yet more than 60 years later, the same tank is once again fighting in Europe. At first glance, this might seem unbelievable. Why would one of the world's largest military powers rely on tanks designed in the early 1960s? The answer isn't that the T-62 is superior. It's that Russia has struggled to replace battlefield losses as quickly as they occur. Throughout the war, both sides have lost thousands of armored vehicles. While Russia continues producing modern tanks, such as the T-90M, manufacturing simply cannot keep pace with the demands of a prolonged, high-intensity conflict. So Moscow turned to something it inherited from the Soviet Union: storage depots. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union prepared for the possibility of a massive conventional war against NATO. Instead of relying solely on future production, it manufactured enormous quantities of military equipment in advance. By the time the Soviet Union collapsed, it possessed one of the largest stockpiles of armored vehicles ever assembled. Thousands of tanks, thousands of infantry fighting vehicles, thousands of armored personnel carriers. Many remained in long-term storage for decades. When the war in Ukraine became a grinding battle of attrition, those forgotten reserves suddenly became valuable once again. Instead of building every replacement from scratch, Russia began refurbishing older vehicles, repairing what could be repaired, and sending them back to the front. The T-62 became one of the clearest examples of this strategy. Although upgraded with improved optics and communications, the tank still carries many limitations that are impossible to erase. Its armor is significantly weaker than that of more modern designs. Its 115mm gun is less capable than the 125mm cannon found on later Soviet and Russian tanks. Its protection against modern anti-tank weapons is limited, and against FPV drones attacking from above, its age becomes even more apparent. The battlefield of Ukraine has exposed a problem few military planners fully appreciated before 2022. Modern tanks were primarily designed to survive attacks from the front, not from the sky. FPV drones changed that equation completely. Flying only a few meters above the ground before climbing over obstacles, these drones can dive directly onto the thin roof armor of a tank, one of its most vulnerable areas. Even heavily armored vehicles can be disabled by a relatively inexpensive drone carrying an explosive charge. As drone attacks became increasingly common, Russian crews began searching for their own solutions. The result looked strange, almost absurd. Steel beams, metal sheets, wire cages, massive welded frames covering entire tanks. Soon, these unusual vehicles earned a nickname across the internet: the turtle tank. From above, They resembled giant metal shells slowly crawling across the battlefield. To many observers, they looked almost comical. Some dismissed them as desperate improvisations. Others mocked their appearance. But behind the memes was a serious tactical purpose. The additional metal structure was designed to detonate FPV drones before they struck the tank's main armor. In some cases, it also offered limited protection against drones dropping explosives directly from above. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't lightweight, and it certainly wasn't part of the original design. But in a battlefield dominated by drones, crews were willing to sacrifice speed, visibility, and maneuverability for even a small increase in survivability. The modifications came with obvious drawbacks. The oversized cages often restricted the crew's field of view. They made the tanks heavier and more difficult to maneuver through forests, villages, and damaged urban streets. Some vehicles struggled to pass beneath bridges or through narrow roads. And while the cages could sometimes reduce the effectiveness of FPV drones, they offered little protection against artillery, anti-tank guided missiles, mines, or larger loitering munitions. In other words, the turtle tank wasn't a revolutionary weapon. It was an adaptation, a battlefield solution created because the threat had evolved faster than the equipment itself. And perhaps that's the most important lesson. When many people think about military modernization, they imagine sleek new tanks, advanced electronics, and cutting-edge technology. But the war in Ukraine has shown that modernization doesn't always look futuristic. Sometimes, it looks like a 60-year-old tank covered in welded steel plates. Sometimes, it looks like soldiers building armor in repair workshops, using whatever materials they can find. And sometimes, it looks like an army trying to protect Cold War machines from 21st century drones. The same pattern can be seen across much of Russia's military equipment. Older BMP infantry fighting vehicles, Cold War-era armored personnel carriers, artillery pieces that have served for decades, even civilian vehicles modified for military use. None of these developments necessarily mean Russia is running out of equipment. Instead, they demonstrate something else. The Kremlin appears willing to use every available resource inherited from the Soviet era before relying entirely on new production. It's a strategy built around endurance rather than efficiency, around quantity rather than perfection. And so far, it has allowed Russia to keep replacing many of its battlefield losses despite the enormous demands of the war. But this raises one final question. How long can that strategy continue? Because even the largest stockpiles eventually run out. And once the Soviet reserves are gone, Russia will no longer be able to fight tomorrow's war with yesterday's weapons. For now, Russia's strategy appears to be working. Despite suffering heavy losses in both manpower and equipment, its military continues to launch offensive operations across multiple sectors of the front. The reason is simple. Unlike the early months of the invasion, Russia is no longer trying to win the war with speed. Instead, it is trying to outlast Ukraine. Every month, thousands of new contract soldiers continue joining the armed forces. Older tanks are pulled from storage and refurbished. Factories operate around the clock, repairing damaged vehicles while simultaneously producing new ones. At the same time, Russia has significantly expanded the production of drones, glide bombs, artillery shells, and electronic warfare systems. The strategy is no longer built around rapid breakthroughs. It is built around endurance. As long as Russia can continue replacing its losses faster than they occur, the military can maintain pressure along the front. But endurance has limits. The Soviet Union left behind enormous stockpiles of military equipment, yet those stockpiles were never infinite. Every tank restored from storage means one less tank remains in reserve. Every BMP pulled from a depot reduces the number available for future conflicts. And unlike the Soviet Union, modern Russia cannot simply produce thousands of new tanks every year. Building a modern armored vehicle is far more expensive, more complex, and takes considerably longer than restoring an old one. The same challenge applies to manpower. Today's Russian army relies heavily on contract soldiers and financial incentives. But maintaining that system is expensive. Signing bonuses have reached levels that would have seemed unimaginable before the war. Regional governments compete to attract volunteers, while military salaries remain significantly higher than many civilian jobs. That approach has successfully attracted recruits, but whether it can continue indefinitely remains uncertain. There is also another problem that cannot be solved with money alone: demographics. Russia, like many countries, faces an aging population and declining birth rates. The generation now entering military age is significantly smaller than previous generations. That means finding enough young recruits may become increasingly difficult in the years ahead. Ironically, this helps explain why so many middle-aged volunteers have appeared on the battlefield. They represent one of the largest available pools of manpower willing, or financially motivated, to sign military contracts. But perhaps the greatest challenge isn't manpower or equipment, it's the battlefield itself. The war in Ukraine has rewritten many of the rules of modern warfare. Before 2022, tanks were expected to dominate the battlefield. Today, a drone costing only a few $100s can destroy or disable a vehicle worth millions. Before the war, reconnaissance often depended on aircraft or satellites. Now, small quadcopters constantly watch trenches, roads, forests, and supply routes. Even simple infantry movement has become extraordinarily dangerous. Every major military around the world is studying this conflict because its lessons extend far beyond Russia and Ukraine. The importance of drones, electronic warfare, rapid battlefield adaptation, distributed command, artificial intelligence. These technologies are changing warfare at a speed rarely seen in military history, and Russia has been forced to adapt in real time, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. The appearance of turtle tanks, the return of Cold War equipment, the rise of drone units, and the recruitment of older volunteers all point to the same conclusion. Russia hasn't completely modernized its military. It has modified it. Rather than replacing its old system, it has blended Soviet-era concepts with modern technology, creating an army that is neither fully traditional nor fully modern. Whether that model proves sustainable will likely depend on factors far beyond the battlefield: industrial production, economic resilience, political decisions, international support for both sides, and ultimately, time. Because wars of attrition are rarely decided by a single battle, they are decided by who can endure longer. Let's go back to the soldier from the beginning of this video, the exhausted man walking alone through the ruins. His story wasn't simply about courage, nor was it just about sacrifice. It represented something much larger. A military trying to fight a 21st century war while still relying on many 20th century methods. An army sending older men into a battlefield dominated by FPV drones. An army bringing Cold War tanks out of storage, welding steel cages onto them, and sending them back into combat against weapons their designers could never have imagined. To some, these images are evidence of weakness. To others, they demonstrate resilience and an ability to adapt under extraordinary pressure. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Russia has shown that it can absorb losses, mobilize resources, and continue fighting far longer than many expected in 2022. But it has also revealed the enormous cost of sustaining a prolonged war against a determined opponent equipped with modern technology. Perhaps that is the defining lesson of the war in Ukraine. In the age of drones, satellites, and precision weapons, victory is no longer determined solely by who has the newest tank or the largest army. It also depends on who can adapt the fastest. Because on today's battlefield, experience cannot stop an FPV drone. Age cannot protect against a precision strike. And even a tank built to survive the Cold War can become vulnerable to a flying explosive that costs less than a smartphone. The war in Ukraine has reminded the world that modern warfare isn't simply about advanced technology. It's about adaptation. And every day that war continues, both soldiers and machines are being forced to adapt, or risk becoming relics of another era.